Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History. This is our fourth unit. Oh my gosh, look how far we've come, haven't we? So, fourth unit. Yes, indeed. We are in a new topic. Same time period, though, 1450 to 1750. So, a lot of the events we talked about in Unit 3. Unit 3, all about land-based empires, we're going to actually see be repeated in this unit. So we will make reference to the Ottomans, we will make reference to the Mughals, we will make some reference as well to things we talked about in units 1 and 2, the Aztecs, the Inca, Mali, Marco Polo. All right, but we'll get there. So, question on the board is bell work, of course. What do you already know about the Age of Exploration? And you might not be familiar with the term Age of Exploration or Age of Discovery, but you might have some information, as we will see today. You might be familiar with some famous explorers like Christopher Columbus. All right, but let's keep going. Yes, indeed, we are on a new unit, and that unit is called by the College Board Transoceanic Interconnections, which is a fancy way of saying that ocean-based trade is going to greatly expand in the time period between 1450 and 1750, leading to increased European involvement in places like the Indian Ocean, and of course in North and South America, as we will see. This is the time period of European colonization. This is the time period of the beginnings of European trade presence in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean trading system. We'll talk about things like the transatlantic slave trade, the setting up of colonies in North and South America, the conquest of the Aztecs and Inca. And we'll also talk about Japan and China as well, and how they are responding to Europeans. All right. So the unit objective is going to be heavily focused on how the rise of new economic developments impacts social structures. So we are going to see some examples of that throughout this class, especially when we start talking about the rise of racial categories. But there are other examples as well that could fit in what we mean by social structures. And today we're going to look at kind of how all of this is beginning. We're going to look at the age of exploration. We're going to look at the causes of the age of exploration. And we sometimes also call this time period the Maritime Revolution. There are several names that relate to Europe involving itself more in international overseas trade. Some people call it the Age of Exploration. Some people call it the Age of Discovery. Some people like to call it the Maritime Revolution. That's more the modern term. Some people like to call it the Age of Colonization. And certainly all of these labels, all of these names are appropriate when we discuss kind of European involvement in overseas trade, and as the map right there is going to kind of describe for us. So the lesson objective today, what you should pay attention to is, 1, how do cross-cultural interactions results in the diffusion of technology, and how does that technology facilitate changes in trade? And we've kind of already explored this, so it's just going to be more formally saying it outright. And then also, how are states involved in the expansion of maritime exploration? All right. And the information I'm going to present in the next 3 slides, you wouldn't need to know necessarily for your Unit 4 test, but it is important contextualization. It is important background information for the Age of Exploration. And we're going to actually look at non-European, well, for the most part, non-European exploration prior to 1450. And the first area we're going to look at actually is a throwback to Unit 0. We are going to look at kind of how different societies are going to appear across the Pacific Ocean. And we generally call this migration and settlement of the Pacific Ocean the Polynesian or Austronesian migrations. This is going to be a time period in which societies from East and Southeast Asia are going to migrate and settle across the islands of the Pacific Ocean. We will see the creation of culturally similar but not completely connected groups of people across the Pacific Ocean. So there will be kind of general similarities, We call these societies Polynesian in very broad terms, but we will see the creation of very distinct societies across the Pacific Ocean during this time period. And it's not just the Pacific Ocean. We also see settlement of Madagascar, for example, so the Indian Ocean as well. And we mostly see that there is going to be this movement of people, mostly because there is an increase in agriculture. We are going to see that overpopulation will lead to people feeling pressured to move beyond Asia. And we do kind of see that the desire for better agriculture, the desire for more arable land, the desire for less crowded conditions, that's going to lead to overseas exploration and expansion. And it's going to kind of be something that will able to be happen thanks to new technologies. It's very similar to what we'll discuss later on today with the age of exploration in the European context. But Polynesian migration is able to happen mostly because of new technologies, especially things like the double-hulled canoe, a very special type of canoe that's able to go over vast distances, carry lots of food stuff, that's able to set up colonies and other settlements across the Pacific Ocean. Also, knowledge of astronomy and the movement of the stars that's able to navigate the Pacific Ocean. And the result of all these Polynesian migrations is going to be the creation of new societies across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. We are going to see, for example, in Hawaii, the creation of Hawaiian civilizations. We'll briefly talk about Hawaii later on in Unit 6. And we'll also kind of see the Maori in New Zealand. New Zealand's indigenous population, known as the Maori. These are going to be people who migrated there most likely because of, you guessed it, the Polynesian migrations. So there is a lot of cross-cultural interaction. There's a lot of settlement in the Pacific Ocean that's happening well before the 1400s. And I feel it's a little problematic kind of comparing these historic developments of people of color to Disney movies, but this is actually the historic context for films like Moana. I'm not sure if there's other films like Moana, but Moana. That's a Disney movie. All right, anyway. We've already talked about the Indian Ocean, but it is worth kind of bearing in mind because we are going to continue talking about the Indian Ocean, mostly because one of the big continuities in Unit 4 is continued participation in the Indian Ocean trade. It's still a major trade system in this period between 1450 and 1750, although there are some changes. So yes, the Indian Ocean maritime system, we've seen that it's mostly dominated by Islamic merchants, but there isn't a single empire that controls all of the Indian Ocean. It is relatively peaceful. There's no real militarized state that controls all of it. And we do see participation not just of Muslims, who are probably the most active in the Indian Ocean, but also of Indian groups, of Chinese groups, of African groups as well. We also see that one of the big continuities in this time period is going to be the continued spread of Islam thanks to Indian Ocean trade. Again, thanks to the Sufis. The Sufis are the group most responsible for trade, or well, not trade, for missionary activity of Islam in the Indian Ocean. However, as we're going to see later on today, actually, we are going to see increased missionary activity, not just by the Sufis, but by Jesuits as well. We will see Catholicism spread into the Indian Ocean because of one of the big changes in the Indian Ocean, and that is the participation of Europeans. So we are going to see that one of the big changes is that despite this continued presence of trade, that a new group is participating and helping facilitate trade, and it's going to be European powers. Although European powers do not dominate ocean-based trade in the Indian Ocean, and arguably they don't until after 1750, but we'll talk about that later. But one group that is definitely not going to be the sole power in the Indian Ocean is not going to be the Chinese. Remember, even though we do see exploration of the Indian Ocean under Zheng He, under that Chinese admiral, we do not see dominance of the Chinese state in Indian Ocean trade. And in fact, one of the things that we are going to see, actually, something we'll talk about more later, is that China is going to kind of turn towards isolationism. It's going to turn towards halting overseas exploration. And a big result of that is no one single state will dominate the Indian Ocean trade. And before we kind of go on to European exploration, it's first important to understand the Atlantic Ocean, because there is evidence of exploration of not only some European groups like the Vikings, as we'll talk about, but also Native American groups as well. And in fact, that's where we'll start, actually. The settlement of the Caribbean is very similar to the Polynesian migrations, in where we will see the settlement of the Caribbean by Native American groups. We will see the development of Arawak and Carib cultures. Carib and Arawak, these are two big Native American groups that generally describe the area of the Caribbean Sea. These are Native American society, kind of general names we call different groups of Native Americans in the Caribbean Sea. And they are going to be the ones who will settle the Caribbean. And we will see there the groups who are going to be in first contact with European explorers, namely Christopher Columbus. But as we're going to see, oftentimes we do see that Europe is going to say, oh, well, Christopher Columbus was the first European to settle in or set foot in the North America. Well, that's actually not true. We do see that there is evidence of exploration of Viking groups, of northern Scandinavian groups as well, or prior to Columbus, I should say. So we do see Viking exploration of the Scandinavian coast, for example. We see exploration of Iceland and Greenland. There's even evidence of a settlement in North America, in modern-day Newfoundland or Newfoundland, if you want to be the kind of person that pronounces it like that. However, despite the fact that Vikings may have settled in North America first, we do not see any permanent settlements. So that's why Columbus and all that will be very important. And finally, we are going to see that until 1400, until after 1400, we don't really have any successful explorations of deeper kind of middle Atlantic areas. We mostly do see that there are some expeditions by Afro-Eurasian states, African states like Mali, they send out expeditions. Portugal as well does that. But prior to 1450, none of these societies are going to be successful, mostly because of the lack of suitable technology. And technology that will come to Europe thanks to Silk Road trade, that is going to be what will allow for overseas exploration, as we will see. All right, so we provided some context. We provided for some non-European examples of ocean-based exploration. Let's get into the meat of it today. Let's get into European exploration between 1400 and 1550. And we're primarily going to look at Spain and Portugal in our first half. But one of the big things you need to understand about this chapter in particular is what is causing, what is allowing, what is motivating European states to undergo overseas exploration. Well, there are four causes of European exploration. And probably the biggest is going to be a desire for trade goods. There is a desire to acquire goods from East Asia, particularly things like spices, tea, silk, etc. And we do see that there is European participation in the Mediterranean Sea. We see kind of groups like Venice trading with the Ottoman Empire, for example. We see Genoa. We see various Italian city-states trading with Islamic powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, we do see that there is a desire for increased, more direct exchange between European groups and East Asia, mostly because many Western European societies, places like Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, England, these places don't want to do business with the Ottoman Empire. 1453, remember, the Ottomans took over the city of Constantinople, thus shutting off Christian Europe to Silk Road trade. Now they have to go through the Ottomans, and the Ottomans do things like charge taxes for merchants who want to do business in their territory. And there is kind of this overall spirit of rabid anti-Islamic idea that is going to prevent many Western European societies, especially Iberian Peninsula countries, from wanting to do business with the Ottomans. So we do see that kind of, in order to not do business with the Ottomans, countries in Europe are going to look for alternative ways to get to Asia. However, a big problem, something that we will see be overcome with the exploration of the New World, is going to be the fact that Europe doesn't have anything China, India wants. And we are going to see kind of something known as a trade deficit, even though Europe wants various luxury, raw, and refined goods from East Asia. A luxury good, that's something like tea or silk. Raw is kind of like cotton or lumber. Refined is furniture or rugs and carpets. That even though Europe wants this stuff, China and India and the some Middle Eastern societies really don't want European goods unless it's silver. So we will see that kind of this deficit of goods. That's going to be something that Europeans will come across as a problem that we'll discuss later on. All right. But there is this desire to find a route to get to China because overland takes so long and nobody has camels or horses. So there is going to be attempts to try and explore overseas to find a way to get to China. One group of people, we'll talk about them later, one set of explorers under the direction of Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz, they're going to look for a way to go around Africa. But we also see that there is legendary kind of ideas that if you go west, if you go through the fabled Northwest Passage, you could get to China by sailing west into the Atlantic. Little do they know, there's two continents there. Another kind of cause for and motivation for exploration is going to be the rise of centralized states. Centralized states are going to be really the main groups of people that will sponsor overseas exploration. And we'll pay attention to two examples in just a second of Spain and Portugal. And mostly these centralized states are looking to do a few things. They're looking to overcome rivals. They're looking to outdo political rivals. For example, Spain is looking to outdo Portugal in Portugal's attempts to find a way to get to China. So we do kind of see that there is this intense political competition for how to control the trade with East Asia. Who's going to be the first European power to find an overseas route to East Asia that doesn't involve going through Islamic states? These centralized states, they're going to be the ones that sponsor exploration, mostly to outdo other states. They also have the money, they have the technology, as we'll see later on. They have new navies, new types of ships, new military units. But there also is a desire, especially by Catholic nations, namely Spain and Portugal, to look for supposed Christian allies. They're looking to not only spread Catholicism, but they're also looking to get Christian allies in their attempts to basically make a crusade against Islamic powers. Portugal and Spain, these are two very Catholic states that are very anti-Muslim. They're looking for allies to drive out the Ottomans, for example. And there supposedly is a secret Christian kingdom in Africa called, well, I don't know what it's called, but it's led by this legendary figure called Prester John. He doesn't exist, but there are rumors he does exist. And there is going to actually be a desire to look for this man and convince him to be an ally to Europe. We also see kind of there's this legendary kind of depiction of China that's fostered through individuals like Marco Polo, for example. A lot of the Italian explorers like Christopher Columbus, they're going to look at Marco Polo's account and they're going to say, wow, China looks pretty cool. I want to see it myself. We also see kind of the legendary figures of Mansa Musa, for example. I mean, Mansa Musa was real, but the tales of his wealth that's going to incentivize European states to also look for routes to Asia. A third reason is actually kind of the influence of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. These are time periods in which there is a interest in the natural world. So there is this scientific discovery kind of atmosphere that exists among European sailors. But probably the fourth reason why European exploration will happen is actually kind of answering our first lesson objective. Is that in earlier units, in Unit 2, we saw that one of the big impacts of overland trade was the diffusion of new technologies. And these new technologies, these are the things that will allow for European expansion, European exploration. And they include things we've already talked about, but also new technologies as well. For example, the use of the astrolabe. The astrolabe was actually developed first in the Greco-Roman times, and it's going to be perfected during the Islamic Golden Age. But from the Muslim lands, we do see the astrolabe making its way to Europe. We see the compass as well. The compass was developed in China. Guess what? It's making its way to Europe thanks to trade, thanks to Silk Road trade. But we're also going to see that Europe is going to add on to these technologies and develop new ways of sailing. For example, we see the adoption of the lateen sail into a new type of ship known as a caravel. And a caravel is a new type of ship that Europeans will use to explore the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. It has a better rudder, that's why it's important, but it's also going to add this lateen triangle sail that is going to allow Europe to more quickly cover ocean distances. But we also do see that kind of the astronomical discoveries of the scientific revolution and building on Islamic civilization, we do see the development of more accurate maps, of gridded maps, gritty maps. So you should be able to answer this lesson or this question right here. What allowed Europe to begin overseas exploration? You should be able to consider both motives and technology. Awesome. So let's look at how states are sponsoring overseas trade. We're going to first look at Portugal because Portugal is going to lead the charge in overseas exploration. And it's mostly going to happen thanks to the work of this man with the really funny hat and the terrible mustache, Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator, he's not a king, he's a prince. He's the son of, I think John II is his name, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, Henry the Navigator is going to be a prominent Portuguese government official who is going to be very active in promoting the sponsorship of Portuguese exploration. He is going to not only fund a lot of explorers, and we'll talk about those explorers later on, but he's also going to be instrumental in setting up a school for sailors, basically, a school of navigation. It might not have existed, but nonetheless, we do see a development of state-sponsored intellectuals who are going to lead the charge in exploration sciences. But why is Henry going to kind of do all this stuff? Well, why is he going to sponsor the making of new technologies? Why is he going to sponsor the adoption of new technologies and new new exploration tactics? Well, let's look at his motivations. For one thing, Henry and the Portuguese government in general, they want to get to India. They want to get all those lovely goods from India. They want spices because Portuguese cooking is very bland, apparently. That's a little joke right there. So they want to get to India. There's also a desire to spread Catholicism. During this time, we do see this very fervent mood amongst Spanish and Portuguese rulers to spread Catholicism, because these are very Catholic societies, very anti-Muslim. Henry is looking for Prester John as well. He wants to find contact with a guy who doesn't exist, but he thinks exists. But of course, the biggest motivation of all is cold, hard cash, is the desire for economic expansion. And we do actually see that Henry is going to sponsor the initial Portuguese settlement of islands within the Atlantic Ocean, islands like the Azores, the Canaries, and some other place, Madeira. So we do see kind of that these will be the first colonies, actually, that Portugal will set up under the reign of Henry the influence, I should say, not the reign, because he's not king, but the influence of Henry the Navigator. We do see the building of cash crop plantations, so plantations dedicated to producing a luxury good, and this luxury good actually is sugar. So we do see the building of colonial establishments in Atlantic islands. We do see Henry the Navigator killing indigenous people on these islands, and he is going to build up plantations. He is going to build cash crop areas. But we're also going to see that one of the most immediate impacts of schools of navigation is going to be first contact with West Africa. And before all of this, there was indirect contact with West Africa. I mean, certainly Europeans knew about West Africa. They knew about Mali. But under the direction of increased overseas exploration, we are going to start to see maritime connections being built between Portugal and West Africa. And this is actually where we will start to see West African and European trade first emerge. It is going to be involved with various things, but one of them is actually going to be slavery. Slaves will be used in these, West African slaves will be used in these plantations on these islands of the Atlantic Ocean. And we're going to see this especially continue much more later on once we see the discovery of the New World. But contact between Portugal and West Africa, that's probably the most immediate impact of the work of Henry the Navigator. Another thing that we are going to see happening is that we do see a beginning of the decline of trans-Saharan trade networks. We do see that Europe is going to be more directly in contact with West Africa after 1450. That's something that's changing. And we do see that Henry is going to support other explorations. And then I'm just going to name drop a few important people. One of them is Bartholomew Diaz. And Diaz is going to be the first European to explore, to use a caravel and make his way all the way to the southern tip of Africa, known as the Cape of Good Hope. And he's going to be the first European that's kind of on the edge between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So Diaz is going to lay the groundwork, but it's his successor, a guy named Vasco da Gama, who is finally going to get to India. This is after Henry the Navigator was around. But he is going to be the first European to travel all the way to India via the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. He's not going to do any of that Mediterranean Sea stuff, go through Islamic world. No, he's directly sailing from Portugal all the way to India. So Vasco da Gama is going to begin a process by which Europeans will start to be more directly involved in Indian Ocean trade. There are other explorations the Portuguese will engage in. We'll talk about Japan and Brazil later on, but these are other examples by the 1500s. Brazil is going to be a Portuguese colony, as we'll see, and Japan is going to, we'll see the impact of Japan on Portugal and vice versa. All right, if we were in class, we would watch this brief clip from John Green. All right, well, in line with that idea that a lot of the motivation for exploration is out of competition is actually going to lead us to the Spanish voyages, because Spain is worried that Portugal would overtake Spain as a dominant trading power. So Spain is going to warm up to the idea of sponsoring exploration. But who is going to sponsor all this exploration? Well, it's two very important monarchs, and we've talked about these monarchs before, and they are Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella, the joint rulers of Spain after the marriage between Castilla and Aragon. I just thought of a joke. What if it was supernatural in Lord of the Rings? Because Aragon, get it? In Castile, the angel. Anyway, that's not important. Well, we do see that Ferdinand and Isabella, they are the predominant sponsors of overseas exploration in Spanish history. They are sometimes called the explorer monarchs. And Isabella and Ferdinand, they are extremely Catholic. I mean, they're the ones that led the conquest of Muslim Spain. They're the ones who kicked out the Muslims from Spain, and they're the ones that successfully ended the Reconquista. So there's kind of more background information that connects us to Unit 2, actually. But Ferdinand and Isabella, their motivations are very similar to Portugal. For one thing, they want to stay competitive with Portugal. But for another thing, they also want to spread Catholicism. They are also very aggressively anti-Muslim. They also want to overtake the Ottomans as the big power in trade, in ocean-based trade. So we do see kind of there is this religious fervor that's associated with Spanish exploration. And probably the biggest expedition of all that Spain is actually going to sponsor, not without some persuasion on the part of this man right here, Christopher Columbus, but the biggest explorer that they are going to sponsor is going to be Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus is, well, we'll talk about how much a jerk he is in our second chapter, but he is an important figure in world history because he is going to, because he believes that there is a direct way to get to India by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, he's going to be the one who will eventually land in the New World. He is going to be the first European to establish permanent relations, permanent economic, political, and social interactions with Europeans and Native American groups. So we do see that as a result of Columbus's expedition, we will start to see the exploration and colonization of North and South America. We'll talk about that a lot more in our future chapters, but it is a prime example of kind of the impact of overseas exploration. It's going to lead to the settlement of the New World. And again, kind of these terms right here are important. We'll talk about colonization more, but it's the idea of Europeans settling in North and South America, settling and building colonies that directly produce goods that are sent back to Europe. And then some terms, they're a bit outdated, but I use them because they are often used on AP texts. Old World, that describes Africa, Europe, Asia. New World, that's North and South America. Of course, it's not a new world because Native American groups live there, but we'll talk about that later. The Spanish are also going to sponsor the exploration of this man. First, this guy named Amerigo Vespucci. He's another Italian explorer who is actually going to confirm that Columbus indeed found a new world, that Columbus found a new set of continents. Columbus died basically saying, "Oh, I discovered India. Ha ha ha." No, he didn't. Well, obviously you know that. But Vespucci is going to confirm that actually, and that's where the name America comes from his first name, Americo. All right. The other major explorer is Ferdinand Magellan. He's actually a Portuguese guy, but he's sponsored by the Spanish monarchy, and he's going to be the first white person to circumnavigate the world. He's going to go around the world. He's also going to explore the Philippines and claim that for Spain as well, and we'll talk about that more later. And kind of one of the big results of these Portuguese and Spanish explorations is that we are going to see the beginnings of both the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. We'll talk about the difference between these two empires in our next presentation, but we do see that their start is going to come as a result of exploration overseas. However, that is not without kind of competition between these two states. These two states are going to be in a bitter dispute about who exactly controls what and where. And we're actually going to see that the Pope is going to step in, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, actually, and he is going to establish the Treaty of Tordesillas. I think that's how you pronounce it, in which it is going to divide the world basically into Spain and not Spain, Spain and Portugal. So we do kind of see that the Portuguese and Spanish empires, they are going to be kind of declared through this treaty right here. And basically the Pope is going to say, Spain, you're a good boy, you're a good Catholic boy, you get the West, you get North and South America and the Philippines too, even though it technically falls out of the line right here. And guess what? Portugal, you're a good boy too, you're going to get Brazil right here, and you can make colonies in Africa and India. So we do see a line of demarcation being drawn in which we do see kind of that Spanish colonies, they are mostly going to exist west of this demarcation line, and Portugal, they're mostly going to be east of this demarcation line. All right, so you should be able to answer this. It's kind of similar to the earlier one. Why specifically did Portugal and Spain want to explore the ocean? And one of the big themes that we're going to see, because this is a world history class, is that Europe is going to develop kind of new relations with African and Asian states. And in turn, these states will be impacted by Africa, or well, by Europe, I should say. However, there are some general things I need to point out because the AP loves making time comparisons with future units, and we do need to lay some groundwork. First and foremost, we are not going to see any colonies in Africa or Asia. No inland colonies in Africa or Asia. Write that down in your brains. Etch that on your skull. It's important to remember that until the 1800s, we do not see inland colonies in Africa or Asia. Inland colonies. There are two exceptions. We have Angola for the Portuguese and the Cape of Good Hope for the Dutch. And we'll talk about those two places later on. However, what we do see is something we're going to discuss in just a second. But why don't we see inland territories? Well, at this point, Europe is on the same level as various land-based empires. Europe has the same technology. They might have better boats now, but they have the same technology, so it'd be very difficult to outright conquer land-based empires, even ones in Africa and Southeast Asia. So we do see that it is very difficult for European powers to establish a foothold in Africa or Asia due to the strength of land-based empires. So what happens instead? What do we characterize this age of colonization? Obviously, North and South America are an exception. We see vast inland territories. But in terms of Africa and Asia, we don't see any inland territories. What we do see is a term historians describe as trading post empires. And a trading post empire essentially describes an empire whose economic and political influence is found in trade posts that are located along the coast of Africa and Asia. So we do see that these trade post empires or trading post empires, they're going to be kind of a way Europe has economic influence. It's through the setting up of trade posts or trading communities in coastal areas. And we call these trade ports, these trade posts, factories. They are not obviously producing manufactured products. They're called factories. Fattoria is the Portuguese name. It comes from a Latin word. I don't know what it means. But we do see that this is what will characterize European involvement in Africa and Asia until the 1800s. That's a very important thing to know. This is what characterizes pre-1800 European colonial expansion. There is no inland territory. There are coastal trading posts. But how does Europe get these trading posts? Well, sometimes they ask politely. Sometimes they make contracts. Sometimes they make special arrangements with land-based empires to have a small merchant community in a coastal area. And we actually do see that in a few states. We see that in China. We see that in Japan, briefly. We see that in India. We see that in the Ottoman Empire to an extent, but not as much. So we do see that there will be negotiations built. Sometimes they're pressured to do it. But we do see negotiations between European states, not just Spain and Portugal, but other ones as well, France, the Netherlands, England. They're going to arrange to have special trading privileges by building special merchant communities. And we will see that in a few places, and I'll talk about some examples. But we also do see evidence of basically looking for weaker coastal societies and straight up just taking that city for themselves. So we will see that some cases, especially the Portuguese and the Dutch, they're going to establish a more direct presence by taking over weaker coastal cities, oftentimes through military force. So we do see some exceptions that there will be kind of some states that don't negotiate special trading privileges, but they do demand territory thanks to superior naval technology. So we do kind of see that in this case, we will see the establishment of what we call tribute regimes or tribute systems. So we do see that Europe is going to essentially allow for local administration to continue. There's a European governor more often than not, but for the most part, things will continue as long as tribute is paid in the form of goods, but also in the form of labor as well. One of the big themes of Unit 4 is going to be this idea of coerced labor or forced labor. Think slavery, for example. So we do see examples of tribute regimes, and I'll talk about some notable examples, especially the Portuguese and the Dutch. A few more general themes about Africa and Asia before we look at Africa and Asia. We will see that these states will use missionaries, but in Africa and Asia, they won't be really as successful as, say, North or South America. We will see that Catholic countries like Portugal and Spain, they're going to use the Jesuits basically to kind of soften up East Asian powers, say, oh, look, now that we have a cultural kind of relation between you and me, why don't we have more economic privileges? So we do see that Spain and Portugal, they will be very aggressive in expanding Catholicism, basically as a way to kind of get in good with East Asian societies. And we'll talk about that more later on. They're mostly going to fail. The exception to all of this is some parts of India and also the Philippines, but we do see a big kind of result. Will be syncretism. We will see kind of that in addition to Islam spreading, we see Catholicism spreading and merging with local customs. That's true in North and South America as well, as we'll see. Yet we do see a major continuity in the form of who is participating. Well, even though Europeans are going to be annoying and they are going to be involved in Indian Ocean trade, they still are the minority. They still are just another group of people participating in overseas trade. Chinese, African, Muslim, and Indian groups, they are still participating. It's just that Europe does as well. However, this is where that idea of deficit of trade comes in, because Europe doesn't have anything East Asia wants. Instead, Europe is mostly going to be what we would call a carrying trade society. The European states would be considered carrying trade societies. And essentially, carrying trade is an informal term. It describes how Europeans are basically just buying goods from some places and selling them in other places in an attempt to get a profit. They are not selling European goods. They're simply buying goods from, say, Africa and selling them into Asia. They're being facilitators of trade. They are a very small minority in overall trade in the Indian Ocean, especially. That's something you need to kind of know. This image right here represents kind of Catholicism. It's Jesus as a sailor in the Indian Ocean. That's kind of, we see that this is able to happen because of trade post-empires. All right. So let's first look at Africa, and we will discuss Africa later on. We'll discuss the transatlantic slave trade more later on. There's a whole basic presentation about that. But what is the kind of relationship between Africa and Europe? Again, no inland territory other than Angola by the Portuguese and the Cape of Good Hope by the Dutch, by the Netherlands. All right, so Africa is going to be kind of the first area where Europe will establish a trading presence. So we do see that African trade is going to be kind of the most immediate result of the establishment of Portuguese trade and exploration. And a helpful way to kind of remember what a trading post-empire is through this name right here, the Portuguese, not inland Portuguese. It is the Portuguese. And indeed, Portugal is going to be the major kind of trading power by Europeans in Africa. They're eventually going to be replaced by the Dutch. They're eventually going to be replaced by the British as well, but we'll talk about that later. And we do see that initially the Portuguese will set up those trade posts or factories along the West African coast. We will see especially settlement in the Gold Coast. So this area down here, it includes different states that I'll talk about in a second. So we do see Portugal will establish trade posts or factories where we will see trade. These African states are largely going to trade things like salt and gold, but also, notably, slaves and ivory in exchange for what Europe has. Africa, that's probably the one place that does want European goods, not China, not India. But Africa wants guns. They want metals, they want textiles. And we'll talk about this cycle of guns and slaves later on, so don't worry. But generally, what kind of characterizes African states? Well, it is important to note that there is going to be a continuity in that African states are still going to retain a lot of local, political, economic influence. And we are going to see actually that European trade is going to help lead to the rise of new states. And a way that we are seeing new states actually is that new groups of people are getting the means to build new states. We are going to see that guns will help centralize power. So we do see that one of the big results of trade with Europe is going to be the rise of new countries, of new states in East Africa. We'll talk about the kind of downside of that later on. In West Africa, kind of two of the biggest trading kingdoms are going to be Benin and Congo. These are two places that are going to make trade agreements with Portugal, eventually with the Netherlands and English. And we do see that these are places that will be more open to allowing Europeans to make factories. They're more open because they really want guns. They want guns to centralize their authority. And this is a prime image right here of an example of how European trade is impacting African states. The East, however, is going to be a lot less reluctant, or a lot more reluctant to trade, mostly because Islam is stronger in East Africa. There's a stronger connection to already existing ocean-based trade societies. So we do kind of see that this is where the Portuguese will take territory by force. It's an example of creating a tribute state, a tribute city-state. All right. So these societies are going to fall under the influence of Portugal in some way or another, in the form of allowing trade posts to exist or by being conquered by the Portuguese. But the impact of this initial trade, and we'll explore the transatlantic slave trade, of course, later on, but the impact is going to be actually that we see a decline in overland trade in Africa, especially the transatlantic slave trade, I should say, in general. We do see that there will be a spread of Catholicism in West Africa and East Africa, so we will see examples of syncretism pop up. Awesome. But we do see that one of the big results is going to be that this period of Portuguese contact is going to begin long-term trade between Africa and Europe, including, of course, the transatlantic slave trade. And this term royal monopoly, just real quick, it does describe basically kind of that the kings of West Africa, they have exclusive trading privileges to trade with European states. In order to get this special privilege, you have to basically ask the king for it. So a king grants a monopoly of trade to the European power he likes the best, and mostly it's he. But we will look at an example of a she when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade. All right, we looked at Africa. What about Asia? And we're going to talk about more than just the Portuguese here. All right, just a little bit of context. As you all remember, Indian Ocean trade, really big. There are different groups of people involved in Indian Ocean trade. We have the Arab zone. This is largely the Arabian Sea between places like Persia and the Arabian Peninsula. We have the Indian zone along the Indian coast. We have the Chinese zone over here in Southeast and East Asia. And of course, as you remember, trade is mostly done in choke points where it's kind of easier to control trade. Places like Aden, which is on the choke point of the Red Sea. Places like Hormuz, which is on the Persian Gulf. Places like Malacca, which is down here in the former Srivijaya Empire. All right, so let's take a look at European powers and how they are inserting themselves into Indian Ocean trade. So Portugal is going to use its navy to try and control key trade areas. These kind of key areas we'll look at in a second, but they are going to see increased Portuguese naval presence. And basically, we are going to see that Portuguese will basically be like thugs or pirates and try and extort people going through key choke points. So we do see that kind of the Portuguese will harass people, will harass merchants who don't have a specially granted passport. It's called the oh my god, what's it called? The charters or something like that. It's basically it looks like the cartas. That's what it's called. So we do kind of see that Portugal is going to essentially intimidate people into trading with them. But we also see that Portugal is going to take over key cities across the Indian Ocean community. We do see through the use of force that Portugal will take over cities like Goa in India, Malacca down here. They'll take it over from the Srivijaya Empire, Hormuz from the Safavid Empire, actually, the Mombasa, which was an independent state on the Swahili coast, Macau. They'll get that through. It's also, I forgot the Chinese name for it, but it's a city in southern China that Portugal will control actually until the 1970s, interestingly enough, but also Calcutta in India. And then there's a Hindus history. That's what I meant. All right, what are other societies involved in Indian Ocean trade from Europe? Well, we got Spain. Spain is going to establish a territory, actually a inland territorial control of the Philippine Islands. We see that it's a tribute regime in which the Spanish, they're going to have a governor there, but this governor is going to oversee that these elites are going to collect tribute. This is actually where Catholicism is successful in the Indian Ocean. That's all you really need to know about the Philippines. All right. But we do see eventually that Spain and Portugal will decline in their influence in the Indian Ocean in favor of two other states that will come to dominate overseas trade by the end of the 1700s. And that includes the Dutch from the Netherlands and the British. Remember, these are two very big societies in terms of merchant presence. And we do see that actually there's a lot of government support for overseas exploration and trade. And we see that best expressed through joint stock companies like the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. And these are two joint stock companies that have government support. But for the most part, they are private individual companies. But these are companies that have a massive amount of military power. You heard me right, military power. These are so wealthy, mostly because they're getting a lot of grants from the government, that they have their own navies, basically. They have their own ability to control overseas trade through military force. And we do see that kind of the government sponsoring of these trading East India trading companies, that they are going to establish the presence of the Dutch and the English in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch East India Company, they are going to use their naval force to take over Spice Islands, so places in Indonesia, modern-day Indonesia. They'll take over the city of Java. They'll build a trade post capital, Batavia. But we also see the Dutch will kind of compete with the Portuguese and beat them out of the Indian Ocean by the 1600s. And then you might see this term somewhere on AP prep materials. Basically, this is a type of ship the Dutch use. It's like a caravel. It's called a flute. I don't know. The Dutch are scum. All right. But finally, let's conclude by talking about the British, the worst group of people in world history. And I say that as a person of Irish descent. So let's keep going. And we'll talk about Ireland, actually, in this unit, very briefly. Basically, they're the first English colony. All right. So the big company that the British and the English Empire will support, eventually the British become the English, or well, vice versa, actually, the English become the British. We basically after 1700, that's when you can call it the British East India Company. Anyway, so how are the British East India Company going to get involved in the Indian Ocean trade? Well, basically, they're not going to be as military aggressive, a shocker, compared to the Dutch. We do see actually that the British are going to basically kind of enter into trading contracts with powerful inland land-based empires like the Chinese and the Mughals by having contracts with these governments. For example, one of the biggest places the East India Company is going to set up is actually in India, is in Mughal India. However, until the 1750s, as we will see later on, we do see actually that the British are not going to outright control Indian territory. They still have to compete with the Mughals, and actually the British lose in wars against the Mughals. And we do see that kind of the Mughals are granting British right to trade out of the goodness of their hearts, basically. They know they can quash the British if they want. However, the British are going to have an economic foothold by getting special trading privileges through the establishment of merchant enclaves and trade posts along the Indian coast. And eventually the British are going to be kind of the dominant European power in India after their victory in the 7 Years' War. We'll talk about the 7 Years' War later on in this unit, a lot more in Unit 5, and Unit 6 as well. But it is going to be what will establish the British as the dominant European trading company, and eventually, after the further rise of the British industrial military power, eventually India will be subdued by the British, but we'll talk about that later. But for now, prior to 1750, Mughals still have the upper hand. Britain is basically controlling just small port cities across the Indian Ocean. Not even just the cities, just little trading posts within them. All right, so you should be able to answer this question. Define a trade post empire. And secondly, I want you to write a thesis about this question, about this prompt. To what extent are we seeing change in African or Indian Ocean, I should say trade, in the period between 1450 to 1750? Write a thesis, a one-sentence thesis arguing in favor of either continuity or change. All right, that was an epic opening to Unit 4. God bless. Hope you find Prester John. See you guys later.